know, is Bob's mentor when it comes to technologies and economics of storing CO2 below ground by using enhanced oil recovery. He is the world's leading authority on this so-called CO2 EOR technology.
Thank you. Do I need to turn this on?
It's on already.
It's on. All right. Thank you. Yes. To the right. Good. I've had the privilege of interacting with Bob over many, many years around energy policies, and particularly the complement, the revenue and the storage complement to CCS. So it's an honor participating in this symposium dedicated to you. On the way to the center, I walked on a street parallel to Nassau, and it was William Street. And it seems Princeton could just add an S to it and one more honor. Okay. The domestic hydrocarbon industry, and I guess even I could make it more broadly, has seen two recent black swans with a third black swan on the horizon. Black Swan 1, shale gas, changed the outlook for U.S. natural gas supply from scarcity to plenty, enabling the U.S. to become a major LNG exporter. Black Swan 2, tight oil, helped break the world oil price, for better or worse, and diminish the economic power of oil exporters. Black Swan 3, and I would put it dimly visible on the horizon, hopefully not a mirage, entails CO2 utilization and storage with EOR, CCUS, for large-scale carbon management and domestic oil independence. First, however, CCUS needs to address and overcome a series of key questions. And there are four in my mind. First is, will CO2 EOR produced oil add to the carbon inventory or displace other produced, and in this case, imported oil? And that's a particularly timely topic as we interact with our European colleagues. Second, with an abundance of hydrocarbons and peak oil demand on the horizon, whose oil will be left in the ground? Third, is storing CO2 with EOR a niche or a robust carbon management opportunity? And finally, to what extent would the sales and tax revenues from CO2 EOR pay for the costs of integrated carbon management? So let me take these in turn. I'll start with the topic of, is it displacing or adding to the carbon inventory? I'm going to start with two situations in the US. First is where we are today in the US and looking out forward 40 years without CCUS. Second is this alternative case where we do have CO2 EOR-based CCUS. So here's the current situation. Because of high costs of CO2 capture, CO2 emissions from power plants are released to the atmosphere, while oil produced by conventional means is imported and consumed based on demand. And what you see, this is the electric power industry, both coal and natural gas. And without CCS, it emits about 1.6 gigatons of CO2 per year on average over the next 40 years, 64 gigatons in 40 years. The numbers are out of, I used a reference case in EIA's latest annual energy outlook. The US imports about 5 million barrels a day net. We import somewhat more, but we also export some product. And that, over 40 years, that's basically 80 billion barrels. And we spend about 160 billion per year on oil imports, a little over 6 trillion in 40 years. Here's the alternative case. I've taken the time period 2021 to 2060. Electric power plants install CCS on 60% of capacity. And that allows them to capture almost a gigaton per year, 36 gigatons in 40 years. It generates approximately $1 trillion in terms of revenues over 40 years. And the CO2 is purchased, in this example, by the EOR industry at $30 per metric ton. And what you see then is, if I then go to this bottom line, with next generation EOR technology, we have sufficient CO2 now to basically produce 2 billion barrels per year, 80 billion barrels over 40 years. And then when you come to the top oil imports, and recall I'm doing this assuming an oil price of $80 a barrel, there are no imports and no dollars flowing out. So if that is the situation, then the question becomes whose oil will be left in the ground. In my view, the oil and hydrocarbon resource base is vast. Conventional oil, shale and tight oil, oil sands, extra heavy oil, and now the residual oil zone, which I'll introduce later in the presentation, along with expectations of peak oil demand, maybe somewhere around 2030, a significant portion of the oil resource and its carbon content will be ultimately left in the ground. The question is, will the oil left in ground be oil that is conventionally produced and currently imported in the U.S., or oil produced in the U.S. by the injection and storage of CO2 captured from power and industrial plants? Basically, in my view, with CCUS and EOR, 80 billion barrels of conventionally produced oil will not be imported in the U.S. and is oil that will be likely left in the ground because there will not be the demand for it. The third topic is CO2 EOR a niche or a robust carbon management strategy? It's a topic I've been dealing with ever since the first IPCC report. Hopefully this information and that to follow will put the issue of niche opportunity to rest. The U.S. has a very large oil endowment, over 600 billion barrels in place. We recover about a third of it, leaves behind over 400 billion barrels. A major portion of this left behind oil, 284 billion barrels, is technically favorable for CO2 EOR, and it's widely distributed, if you can see on the map of the U.S. Uh-oh, I did it. Can I just hit a forward button? Nope. Am I okay? Okay. Uh-oh. I must have done something really bad.
You didn't do it.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So let us look at what is the potential demand for CO2 by EOR. We've looked at it in terms of, as I mentioned, economically recoverable oil. It assumes $80 a barrel sometime in the past 2020, $30 per metric ton for CO2, and a rate of return of 20% before tax. With next generation, there's 80 billion barrels of economic recoverable oil. Recall that's about our expected imports for the next 40 years. And there's a demand for CO2, 37 billion metric tons. Again, very similar to the situation I described. So there's a nice convergence here. In fact, they were done together. There's also, in addition to the conventional oil endowment in existing structures and fields, there is a residual oil zone. There's over 200 billion barrels of this oil that's left behind. Some of it is below oil fields, some of it is in large fairways. And what we did was to look at 12 counties in the Permian Basin to establish these numbers. And let me show you that. What we did was to take 275 well logs of the ROZ interval. This is now only the San Andres. And it basically shows that there is a interval below the main pay oil zone that is porous, it's pervasively dolomitized, and basically sits below the productive main pay zone in San Andres and over a low non-commercial limestone and shale. We broke each of these 12 counties into geologically similar partitions and then attempted to divide the resource into higher and lower quality. Just to give you a setting, what does this all mean? If you start with the pre-water flood, this is the Great Wasson Field in West Texas. But at its discovery, you can see the oil saturation, 75, 80%. And then this is as far as traditional drilling goes, because here you begin to produce free water. Below there is this extensive hundreds of feet of residual oil zone. After industry's water flood, they've driven the saturation down to around 30, 35% or so, and the saturation is similar to what is in the residual oil zone. And you would expect that because this was created by Mother Nature's water flood due to basically basin tilt and hydrodynamics. And just a quick tabulation for time. I won't take you through all of the numbers, but basically here's the oil in place I talked about, 238. Technically recoverable, about 55 billion barrels. Economically recoverable, 38, and an economic demand for CO2 of 19. And the importance of this is you add this demand for CO2 to the conventional fields, and you're beginning to approach the capacity to take about 90% of the CO2 that would be captured by power plants. So finally, fourth topic, can CO2-EOR make carbon management economically viable? And we show that if you link both the sale of CO2 and the revenues, transfer revenues it generates, I'll talk about that, it would support about $67 per metric ton. 30 comes from the sale, 37 could be provided as basically revenue neutral tax credits. You call it incentives from incremental domestic oil production. And as opposed to a barrel of imported oil where all of the revenues stay overseas, a barrel of domestically produced oil provides royalties, taxes, state severance taxes, and a number of other, let's call it income transfers that go through state and federal treasuries. And in honor of Bob, I've decided to put up a whole bunch of numbers, but basically I start with $80 a barrel oil. I begin to point out where all of the dollars go, different line items. Here's the purchase of CO2, here's operating the field, here's the CapEx. You end up with some net cash, if you want to call it profits, you pay taxes on it. Some of it goes to mineral owners, if they're lucky. A large chunk, 1660 of that, goes to federal state treasuries. And recall that if I now divide that by 0.45, which is about 0.45 tons of CO2 per barrel of oil, that comes to $37 per metric ton of CO2. The power industry sells their CO2, and they get basically $30 a metric ton. And then the US economy gets about $30 a barrel, or somewhere about $65 per metric ton in terms of supporting jobs and manufacturing. So, in conclusion, my view is CO2-EOR for carbon management could enable the US to achieve energy, particularly oil independence. We're already pretty close to natural gas independence, and clearly coal. We export coal. While greatly reducing CO2 emissions from the electric power sector. First, there's a need to address and overcome a series of real and perceived barriers hindering CCUS becoming widely accepted, including communicating the full sets of benefits of CO2 produced oil that stores CO2 over conventionally produced oil that does not store CO2. Finally, use of CO2 could provide $67 per metric ton of incentives for capturing CO2 and in form of sales and revenue neutral tax credits. The alternative, of course, is to have a tax on carbon and then rebate that, which, depending on maybe Brad, you'll talk about some of that, the 45Q idea as an incentive, or has been proposed by others, placing a tax and then rebating it under a carbon neutral situation. With advances in technology, targeted financial support, and the addition of the ROZ resource, this could enable the current U.S. electric power industry to install carbon capture and sell nearly all of their captured CO2 for use and storage by the EOR industry. Thank you very much.
Well, we do have time for some questions. There are right here.
So it wasn't clear to me what the net flux of CO2 into the atmosphere is going to be from the scheme. You're going to take CO2 that would have gone into the atmosphere and put it underground, but you're going to burn the oil and put more CO2 into the
Well,
atmosphere. So what's the
sure.
That's
why I introduced a topic that we're going to burn oil. It's based on demand and consumption. And you either burn oil that you import, which does not provide any support to the CO2 capture system, or you basically burn oil that has been produced by enhanced oil recovery, which stores the CO2 that's captured basically from power plants. So there is a net benefit if you accept my premise that this is a displacement as opposed to an addition.
My question is, what's the net CO2? What fraction of the CO2 that created by burning the oil are you actually?
You basically, let's say I'll use roughly a half a ton of CO2 per barrel of oil that you put in the ground, and the carbon content of the oil that's coming out of the ground is around 0.4. 0.3, depending on how much you use for petrochemicals and non-fuel sources, somewhere around 1/3 to 40% of a ton comes out of 0.4 tons comes out of a barrel of oil that's produced. Does that help? All right. Yes.
Have you also looked at the outcome with oil prices much lower than $80 a barrel? So your scenarios had $80 oil. In particular, because the world oil market is global,
I understand.
As we hit the peak demand, we're already seeing, at least in the short term, and it's persisting, plenty of inventory keeping the price low. So the long-term outlook for oil prices is going to get depressed. And so have you done, scenarios that think this through at, I would say, substantially lower oil prices?
I understand. Well, that might be pushing it, but 50 to 60 might be a realistic target. I tried my numbers to the EIA's reference case, which gets oil to about $80 a barrel in the, you have to tie it to something. My personal view is that somewhere around $55, $60 is a more equilibrium price if you begin to look at where the marginal sources come from. Shale oil, which is one of the marginal sources, is roughly in that ballpark. Now, technology may make it better, but then you always have to move to a continually less geologically attractive resource. So the reason I put this up was to say many of these costs, the CO2 purchase price, the recycle cost, which is primarily energy, basically the royalties, the production taxes, even the G&A costs, which have a large fuel cost, are tied to energy cost, oil price. I have not looked at it at $60. This is a major effort because the way we do it, we start with about 2,000 fields and put them through a reservoir model, produce the oil and create the demand for CO2, and then put that through an economic model. That clearly would be a productive next step.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
John took it.
Bill, the DOE estimates the social cost of CO2 at an extremely low value of $37 per ton. The recent work out of Jacobson's lab was at $220 per ton. Yeah, I find the $16.60, or going all the way up to $30, to be a very interesting number because it suggests to me that the capital income to federal and other receivers is being offset against the social cost. And even if you take the lowest DOE value, you're looking here at $30 versus $37. Sounds to me like it is an interesting way of raising taxes, but an overall net loss to the environmental system that's going to have to be paid in the future.
Well, I guess it depends on where you start with the premise. Clearly, if you could impose CCS on the industry, and they would have to do it no matter what, yes, I think what you say is correct. If, however, you need to have the marketplace provide certain incentives and the tax system provide, let's call it revenue neutral type of support, then this is how it plays out.
One more question? If not, let's thank all of them.
Oh, I'd like to acknowledge the support we've gotten from the DOE Energy National Laboratory and some very, very fine people that are there. And I hope they stay.